Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's Talk event. We have a very special guest here today, and this event is with the Institute for Justice. We have some handouts over there, which we will hand out during the event. So let me introduce you to our speakers. So on your right here is Kirby Thomas West, who is an attorney at the Institute for Justice. She litigates cases protecting educational choice, First Amendment rights, and property rights. Her educational choice practice, which is the subject of today's speech, will be sees her defending school choice programs in state and federal court, including the SCOTUS case for Carson v. Macon. Her First Amendment practice focuses primarily on First Amendment retaliation, and she's working on such cases in Wisconsin and Michigan currently. And her property rights practice focuses primarily on civil forfeiture, and she's litigating 2 class action lawsuits challenging forfeitures in Detroit and impoundment of vehicles in Chicago. On your left here is our very own Professor Chutkow, who's a professor here at Cornell Law School, currently teaching constitutional politics. She's the executive director of the Society for Empirical Legal Studies, and her research explores interactions among political institutions, particularly Congress and the courts, using empirical, qualitative, and legal analysis. She also focused on judicial politics, political institutions, and torts and con law. And she's practiced law in Chicago before entering academia, and here she teaches at the law school level and at the undergrad level. So without further ado, let's start this event. This is school choice after Espinoza and Carson v. Macon. Thank you.
I stay here with people for the recording. Is that okay? Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Federal Society for inviting me and Professor Chutkow for joining us. And I really appreciate all you guys being here on an evening that I know you all have other things you could be doing. As Ben mentioned, we're talking today about educational choice, and as Ben also mentioned, this is just part of my practice at the Institute for Justice. I work on a lot of other kinds of cases, but I will confess that educational choice cases are my favorite cases. And this is because I think educational choice is almost unique in a policy issue where it's not a question of like, okay, if we make progress here in 5 or 10 years, this can help people in this way. It's there are children now who are in schools that are failing them. And it's not just about the long-term opportunities that getting in the right school is going to give them. It's their just daily experience is totally different when they get to leave a school that's just not working for them and go into a school where they can flourish and thrive and really meets their needs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've been with educational choice litigation and the legal landscape of educational choice, and then kind of look forward to what our cases are going to look like going forward and what I think are some big issues coming down the pipe in the realm of school choice. So I'll start rewinding back about 20 years, a little over 20 years. When educational choice programs were just kind of being developed. There was an educational choice program in Cleveland that was kind of your very traditional educational choice program, a voucher program. So low-income families were eligible to participate in the scholarship program. They can get a voucher from Cleveland and use that voucher at a variety of schools. That program was challenged as a violation of the Establishment Clause because some of those families took their voucher and chose to use them at private religious schools. And so what the opponent said is, hey, you're taking this voucher from the government, you're using it as a religious school. This violates the separation of church and state as enacted by the Establishment Clause. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, this doesn't violate the Establishment Clause for the very simple reason that the benefit goes to families. This isn't a benefit that the government says, religious schools are great, we're going to give religious schools some money. It was the government saying, here is a means for you, family, to choose what is best for your child. And you can use this benefit at a private religious school. You can also use it at a private secular school or a variety of other options. And where the government is neutral, like that, neutral regarding religion or non-religion, there's no violation of the Establishment Clause. With that question settled, a new question, still in the realm of the First Amendment, arose and became the target of school choice cases for the next about 20 years. And this was the question of the free exercise clause. So a lot of state constitutions have what's known as a Blaine Amendment. These are named for Senator James Blaine, who in the late 19th century tried to pass an amendment to the US Constitution prohibiting the use of government money to any sectarian institution. At that time, there were a lot of Catholic immigrants in the United States, and it was widely known that sectarian meant Catholic. There was a lot of anti-Catholic bias in the country, and of course, public schools at that time were de facto Protestant schools, right? They read from the Bible, there was prayer, there was hymns in school, and what James Blaine and his supporters wanted to do was prevent any of that government money going to families who use it at Catholic schools or going to support Catholic schools. That amendment failed, but a lot of states successfully did adopt these amendments where the state constitution prohibits state funds going to sectarian institutions. And that became the focus for opponents of school choice programs for a really long time, and something that we litigated for a really long time in a lot of different states. And this came to a head for us in our case Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. In that case, we represented a mom who had children in schools in Montana, and she was part of a scholarship program where Montana has a tax credit scholarship program. We get tax credits if you donate to a scholarship program, and then that scholarship program can give scholarships to mostly low-income children to attend private schools. And Montana, because Montana has a Blaine Amendment that prohibits state funds going to sectarian schools, the Department of Revenue promulgated a rule and said, because of our Constitution, we can't allow families to use this voucher or to use their scholarships at private religious schools. They have to choose only private secular schools. That went up to the Montana Supreme Court, and the Montana Supreme Court said, Department of Revenue, you're right that this would violate our Constitution, but you were wrong that you could make this rule. Actually, the whole program is unconstitutional under our state constitution. We just cannot allow something that allows families to choose private religious schools because of our Blaine Amendment. This went up to the Supreme Court, and we got a decision in 2020. And in that decision, the Supreme Court reversed the Montana Supreme Court. And what they said is, if you have a program that is equally available to families choosing private secular schools, and they can, choose from a wide variety of secular schools, you can't exclude religious schools only because they are religious. This is blatant discrimination against religion in violation of the Free Exercise Clause, right? The Free Exercise Clause guarantees your right to practice your religion. And one part of that is choosing to send your children to religious schools. When we got this decision in 2020, we were also litigating a case in Maine at the same time. And in that case, Maine has a really old educational choice program because it's such a rural state that some school districts actually don't operate public high schools. They're too small. And they offer tuition benefits for families to choose to either send their kids to a public school in another district, or they can choose any private school. They had a restriction on that was enacted in the 80s, limiting that only to non-sectarian schools. And so you could choose literally any private school in the country or out of the country. You could choose an all-girls school, an all-boys school. There's no restrictions on what the curriculum was, but the only requirement was it could not be a quote-unquote sectarian school. So we're litigating this case in the First Circuit, and we had argued it, and we were waiting for the decision to come down when we got the decision in Espinoza. And as you can imagine, we were very pleased to file a 28J letter right away and say, hey, First Circuit, we've just gotten this decision. The Supreme Court has made it pretty clear that this is unconstitutional, and we should win. But we didn't. The First Circuit said, no, actually, this is different than what Montana was doing. Because in Maine, what we do is we don't just say, okay, you're affiliated with a religion, so you're automatically out. We look and we see, even if you're affiliated with a religion, if you're not too religious, if you're not really doing religious stuff in the school, you can participate. We're not discriminating based on religious status. We're looking at religious use. And so what they were doing there was kind of identifying something that the court had sort of left open in Espinoza. There was a footnote in Espinoza where Chief Justice Roberts said, this is, he was talking about discrimination based on religious status, and said, this isn't to say that religious discrimination based on religious use is any more constitutional, but we're not deciding that issue right now. And so we lost in the First Circuit based on this, the distinction between discrimination based on religious status and religious use. We petitioned for cert, and were granted cert, and went up to the Supreme Court again in Carson v. Macon. And in Carson, the Supreme Court said, no, we meant what we said when we decided Espinoza. If you have a program that is available to all kinds of schools and people can participate and choose a wide variety of things, you can't discriminate against, you can't exclude schools based on religion. And it doesn't matter that you're saying, oh, this is religious use rather than status. And there's some really good explanation from Justice Gorsuch back in Espinoza, actually, where he said, it's nonsensical to make this distinction. Would you say that a religious person prays before eating a meal, or would you say it's a religious thing to do to pray before eating a meal? This distinction really breaks down, and you can see how just kind of by a matter of semantics, you could get around the Espinoza decision if the court had allowed this to happen. So after Carson, that was really the final nail in the coffin for all of these challenges to educational choice programs based on Blaine and Nance. It is totally 100% clear now after Espinoza and Carson taken together that if you have a generally available program, you cannot exclude schools because they are religious, and you cannot exclude schools because they do religious things at that school. This was pretty huge for us because, like I said, we had been litigating this issue for almost 20 years. It had been a long time, and it had been the focus of opponents of school choice programs for such a long time that after the decision, we were kind of like, okay, well, what's next? What are, we knew that opponents of the school choice programs were not going to give up. And we started to think about, what's going to be coming down the pipe next, and what are we going to see? And we've seen a lot of different things. We've seen challenges based on other provisions of state constitutions. In New Hampshire, for example, there's a requirement that all the state lottery funds have to be used in public schools. And there was a challenge to the school choice program there saying, we want to make sure that all this money, that none of the lottery money is going to the educational choice program that we have in New Hampshire. The public school expenditures in New Hampshire are like $1 billion. The lottery funds are like 125 million. So it's clear that they're getting at least as much of the lottery funds. But anyway, that was one area of challenge, guarantees of public access of public school, and argument that the existence of school choice programs is going to divert funds and threaten this right to public school education. So we're seeing some very state constitutional specific, or even state law specific challenges. But the area that I think is the most interesting part of working on it is a similar and almost an analog to state plan amendments. But rather than being based on religion, they're based on the public or private. So they say, but no government funds, and there's different kinds of language. Usually it says, the state shall not spend funds for the direct benefit of private institutions or private educational institutions. And the question there is, in part, a state law question. What does it mean to directly benefit a private school or a private institution? And in part, there's a federal question here, because for over 100 years, the Supreme Court has said that a parent's right to control the education and upbringing of their child is a fundamental liberty interest guaranteed by the Constitution. And the Supreme Court has even described that right as among the oldest liberty interests recognized by the court. And so if you have a situation where a state constitution says, you state legislature cannot ever offer a benefit to a group of people, and that group of people is parents who choose private schools, which states correctly choosing private schools has been recognized as fundamental liberty interest as part of the right to control the education and upbringing of your child. That's a problem, right? Because the Supreme Court has said on tons of occasions that you can not condition the receipt of a benefit on the giving up of a constitutional right, or your exercise of a constitutional right. And similarly, you cannot, the court has said that you cannot restrict state legislatures and single out a specific group of people for special disability and special obstacles to getting some kind of benefit from state legislatures, local governments. And this is what we're litigating currently in Alaska. The Alaska Constitution has one of these direct aid clauses. So we're arguing in Alaska State Court right now that first of all, this isn't a direct benefit. So the Alaska program is kind of like Maine, and it's very unique to Alaska's geographic situation, where people are really spread out. And it served as a correspondence school program where people in really rural areas would actually get their assignments by float plane, and then they would send them back to their teachers by float plane, and they would do school kind of remotely this way, pre-Zoom. And it has evolved now to be, as you can enroll in a correspondence school and get an allotment. And with that allotment, parents, it's essentially like an education savings account. Parents can choose anything. You can get PE credits by sending your kids to like Taekwondo class. You can do like a cake decorating class. It's like a extracurricular thing. There's like loads and loads of approved vendors. And you can choose from public universities. A lot of families, either University of Alaska or other public universities, look at courses. You can really design your child's education however you want. And what we're saying is, where a parent and a family can choose a public institution, they can choose a private institution, they can choose combinations of the two. You really can't say that the state is giving a direct benefit to any one institution, because when the state's giving the benefit, they don't even know where that money is going to end up. You know, they have no control over directing it in any one location. So as a matter of interpretation of the state constitution, we're arguing this is not a direct benefit. And then we have some good precedent from Arizona that I won't get into, but that kind of supports this argument about, and I think it's an intuitive one too, right? If you had a food stamp program, right? The government had a food stamp program, you wouldn't say, oh, this is a direct benefit to Safeway. It's like, no, this is a benefit for people who want to buy food, and they might go to Safeway, but they might go to Giant. We don't know. And so as a matter of state law, we're arguing that. And then we're also arguing that if the state is going to interpret the Alaska Constitution in this way, they're going to run up against these federal constitutional guarantees that I just mentioned. And in Carson and in Espinoza, the Supreme Court made clear that if you, state Supreme Court, have this situation where you could interpret your constitution to either be consistent with the US Constitution or run headlong into guarantees of the US Constitution, you should really pick the former path. So I'm excited to see where that goes. And I'm eager to hear Professor Chutkow's takes on all of this, and happy to hear any questions as well.
All right, well, thank you very much. This is really interesting work. It's been going on for a while, obviously, and the litigation strategy IJ has shifted. So my role here is to talk a little bit about what the next possible litigation might look like, some of the maybe problems with where some of the litigation posture may take us if we extend it out too far. So just, you were mentioning the lottery and money's going to public schools rather than being allowed for the private schools. So there have been some and I understand why you're using Pierce v. Society Sisters. This is the case from the 1920s. It basically gives parents the right to direct what their children do. Because it gets you out of the free exercise, First Amendment side, and gets you into this fundamental right side. So there have been some companion arguments showing up on the free exercise side that are somewhat similar to this argument, in which scholars and potential litigants have been saying it is a violation of the free exercise clause, and maybe potentially a violation of your fundamental right under Pierce to direct your children, to have the state using its funds only to fund its property tax funds or its other funds only to fund public schools. That in doing so, if those monies can't be transportable, so states that don't have transportable, if you can't take the property taxes, you pay and bring them to a private institution. From a religious perspective, it's discriminatory against people who have religious points of view, because they don't want their children to be in public schools. They want them raised religiously. There's a free expression side where they don't want their children spoken to about certain values and things. They want it done elsewhere. And that if you are of that religious inclination, you are paying twice for access to schooling your kids. You're being discriminated based on your religious views. You have to pay property taxes, and then if you want to go to a private school, you have to pay for the private school as well. You don't get an excuse out of property taxes. So I'm interested in your response to that has a lot of problems on a lot of levels if it ever became actual, but based on a lot of the litigation and the direction that this is heading, there are people arguing that. So I'm interested in your response to that.
I think, like as a matter of policy, it's preferable to give families options, but I think as a matter of law, I don't see that argument having a lot of legs. I have seen people make it. And the reason is just because it's twofold really. One is that we have had such a long history of this happening in the public school systems, like this set has been around for such a long time. And school choices are relatively new invention, with a few exceptions, like Maine is some of the New England states also have tuition programs like Maine's that are over 100 years old. But in general, I don't think that the court is going to be eager to say like, oh, our understanding of this basically since the founding that this isn't required, that the state provides you money to go to religious schools, it has been wrong this whole time. I think that it seems unlikely to me. And in our litigation, we've always taken the position that states are not under an obligation to create any kind of benefit program. States, if they choose to have a public school system, and for whatever reason, they don't want to enact any alternatives to the public school system, that's a matter of democracy, right? Like people in the state can say, we'd rather have educational choice programs, please, state legislature, pass an educational choice program. But the state is within its rights to not do that. But I think where the argument is compelling is once either in a direct prohibition saying you can never institute these programs, like in the case of Alaska, where you have a constitutional ban on ever creating this kind of program, then I think you do run into problems. And you're talking about the First Amendment claim, and we actually have what we call a hybrid claim. So after Smith versus Employment Division versus Smith, the Supreme Court, it's kind of been a mess since then, but the Supreme Court has said if you have a generally applicable law and it burdens religion, it gets a different kind of scrutiny than if you have a law that's specifically targeted at religion. But a caveat to Smith and later interpretations of it has been if you have a hybrid right where you're not just asserting a First Amendment right, but you're asserting a First Amendment right plus some other constitutional right, then we might get back in the realm of heightened scrutiny. And even in Alaska state courts have said, if you have this hybrid right, we're going to give you strict scrutiny. And what we're saying in Alaska is we have a hybrid right, right? Because it's the parents in our clients, they want to send their children to private school, not just as an expression of their direction of the control and upbringing of their children, but also as a matter of religious exercise. That they want to choose, some of our clients are choosing religious schools specifically because it's part of their religious exercise. So I think that there is still work to be done in the educational choice sphere in the free exercise realm, but I think it's more likely to be in this hybrid right space than it is to be in, we have an affirmative right to an educational choice program or none currently exists.
So that there are, so the push on the whole school choice side of it, and by the way, we're in a very, you all probably know this, but we're in a very unusual time with respect to school choice. COVID moved the needle so enormously because parents were sitting at home with their children, kind of seeing what school looked like, or having interactions with the schools themselves that they didn't feel were satisfactory. But the push on this is from the other side. There are a lot of strong, very politically well-connected forces who feel that this entire push towards school choice, and this is legitimate, is taking money away from the public schools. It's devaluing the public schools. It's leaving public schools with the most challenging students to have to teach because they have to take everybody, whereas private schools don't have to do that. And that it's an attack on an institution that has been a unifying force. So there's a lot of very strong pushback on what IJ is doing and what the entire school choice is doing in terms of pushing these options. So I'm interested in your reaction to sort of three flavors of potential political attack and legal attack, actually. So what that means is that this is going to be something that people who are interested in seeing public schools remain as public schools and not have to lose money and not have to lose share to private institutions, religious or not, are going to work very hard with political connections to make some changes. So I kind of see this in three possible flavors. One is sort of general regulation. So one of the great compelling things about school choice is it's competitive. It forces public schools to be more competitive because you have to respond to the fact that there's somebody else in that market. But the response to that by public schools is, yeah, it's competitive, but it's not competitive on the same playing field. Like private schools can do a lot of different things and have a lot of leeway that we don't have. So one of the arguments may be, let's make private schools have to live up to the same kind of standards. So if you're not in a right to work state, labor contracts, guarantees for teachers not to seniority and tenure, ADA compliance for buildings. By the way, ADA compliance could be a proxy for going after parochial schools, because many Catholic schools are in really old buildings. And if they had to retrofit in order to do that, that would be a real problem. Completely. So enforcing ADA compliance. So what do you think of that as a first flavor? Is this just sort of general regulation? You should even up the playing field, and so government, political entities, and going after private school by virtue of saying it's not even playing field.
I think it's a totally general matter. The government is within its rights to set certain standards and say, if we have a program, if you want to participate, you have to, you have to provide this general curriculum standard, or you have to be ADA compliant, or,
Right.
I think it would be a hard legal challenge. But the caveat to that would be, even otherwise like neutral kind of policy or restriction, if it's obvious that it's taken expressly with anti-religious animus, the Supreme Court has said that that's not cool, right? That's Luke Cooney, where there was an ordinance against animal sacrifice, and that was specifically targeted at a religion that was practicing animal sacrifice. And you're like, maybe a state would want to have rules about how you would dispose of animals or slaughter animals. But when you develop this rule because you wanted to get rid of these religious people, that wasn't okay. So I think that would be the caveat. But in general, I do think it would be much harder. It's harder to challenge kind of general standards that are applied to across the board.
All right, so what about this? Here's the second flavor. And this is more along the lines of basic anti-discrimination laws. So we're seeing this come up, master piece cake, which the Supreme Court kind of punted on, 303 creative, which the Supreme Court kind of punted on because there were already sort of agreements as to what was speech and what wasn't speech on that case. But so you're seeing a lot of states that have, and this is politically appealing, passing laws that are designed to prevent discrimination against a broad range of groups. But if they start insisting on these being applied to private schools and religious schools in particular, I think Yeshiva University in New York, and the state of New York are at loggerheads now about LGBTQ, the disallowance of LGBTQ plus at Yeshiva. This has been bouncing back and forth. But so, what do you do about those applications and this friction between religious freedom and sort of general anti-discrimination laws that the public decided are worthwhile and a lot of it?
Yeah, I think it's a similar answer, right? Because it's a generally applicable law, and so it's treated differently. This is an issue that I think is definitely coming, but will be left to more religious liberty specific organizations to fight it out. IDA doesn't have a strong position on this, but what I will say is, I think one area that would be problematic is if the anti-discrimination laws apply to teachers, because the Supreme Court has said that there's a ministerial exception where you really can't enforce anti-discrimination laws if you're controlling where teachers at private religious schools are acting almost like ministers, where they're also teaching about their faith. And when you are hiring people to instruct on your faith, you can choose people who are aligned with your values and your faith, and that you can't be prohibited from doing that. I think when it comes to student admission, that's a very different story. And I I'm inclined to think that, just totally guessing that would be constitutionally permissible for states to have like a generally applicable law that says you can't discriminate on certain bases in accepting students if you want to participate in our program. I will say though, most in our experience, in Ivy's experience, a lot, like it's not a huge issue. Like most of the big religious schools that we see do not discriminate in accepting students. You know, they want to hire teachers that are aligned with their vision and their values, but often we don't see a ton of discrimination based on student acceptances. But I do think that those two things would be different.
All right, and one question, this is less of the flavor of what might be coming out, because there's, again, a lot of resistance to the way this school choice movement is going. Have you thought about, so there is in many state constitutions, there is educational advocacy provisions, and this is shown up in litigation for school finance in great deal. So the fact that your property taxes are going to more wealthy districts than to not, because their property taxes are higher, and that's violating educational adequacy because we're giving more money to ones who are not.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about any purchase for that with respect to ensuring that school choice should be allowed?
Yeah, that like public schools are doing it.
Yeah.
I think that's really compelling. I think we're a libertarian law firm, so we have like a natural revulsion to asserting like, you know, I have a right to some kind of benefit, and that I have a right for the state to. I think it would be something that it would be tricky for us to like to get our minds around. But I do think just as a matter of policy, it's great to point to these things and say like, look, we have set these goals for ourselves and our children in the state, and we are just failing to meet them consistently. Like, why can't we do something else? And again, whatever. I think public schools are great. I went to public school K through 12. I had a great experience there. And so I think like we should continue to invest in our public schools and make sure that the problems there are being addressed. But it's not enough to say like, okay, well, we're going to keep giving them money and maybe in 10 or 15 years it's better, or maybe if we try this down the road, things will get better. Like there are kids now that are in these schools that aren't learning to read and they're not learning math. And it's like, if we can help these kids now and take them and put them in a school that works for them, that's so much better. And so I think, I don't know, I'd have to think about it more. I think it's an interesting legal argument, but certainly as a matter of policy, we should look to like, we have expressed these goals and we are just totally failing to meet them. What can you do to do that better?
All right, well, I see we have 1 minute left, so we're gonna end on time. And my understanding is that if anyone has questions for me, but I think me basically for Ms. West about the litigation strategy with IJ, we can open it up to the floor.
Is it just about the litigation strategy, or can I ask you general questions?
Sure, great, thank you.
So I went to public school in Florida, and school choice is like a hot button issue every year in our legislature. And you mentioned at the beginning that like some criticism is that people see it as like you're just sucking money away from the public, and that's kind of what I saw, or at least it's what everyone talks about. And so you see, like in Florida, we have really crummy public education, but it's seen as like the charter school just trying to take it away, and you might have more choice, but it's kind of like the overall level of education just lowered all around. I don't know, is there any like evidence against that?
Well, I would say charter schools are actually public schools, right? So it's slightly different, because charter schools are part of the public school system. So it's really not, it is, I guess, a kind of school choice, but it's not in the same way as giving families money to choose where to go. It's a different kind of thing. But I will say, the criticism that school choice diverts resources away from public schools, it's not really borne out by the data. So when we look at spending per student spending in public schools, the graph just goes like this. And just over time, we're putting more and more and more and more money into public schools. And we're not seeing, in many cases, we're not seeing improved outcomes. And when you have school choice programs, we actually have a strategic research division at IJ where we research the issues that we're interested on from people who have PhDs and know how to do this kind of stuff better than I do. And we look into it, and when you have a school choice program, you don't see the kind of drain that people talk about of resources out of the public schools. That's not to say that there won't be some kids who are trapped in schools that are public schools that are failing because for all kinds of reasons, because their parents don't know how to navigate a school choice system or don't know how to get their kids out or they don't have people in their lives that are interested in helping them get out of a failing school. That is a huge problem and it's something that we should all really care about. Like the fact that there are kids in our country that are suffering and will continue to suffer basically, you know, no matter what we do with educational choice is something that we should care about. But what do we do about that is what we do about that. Okay, so therefore we have to punish the kids who we could need help, right? Like we know there's a failing school and even if we have a choice program, there are some kids that are gonna be stuck in this crummy school. Even if we have a school choice program. But is the answer then only people who can afford to get out of that school district should get to go to private school? No, the answer is let's help who we can, not ignore the fact that there are kids still stuck there. Let's try to help them too. But if there are people that we can immediately pull out and put in a school where they're going to learn to read and they're going to learn how to do math and they can get on grade level or they can have their needs met in other ways. And you mentioned special needs kids. Sometimes special needs kids really need to be in a private school because there are schools that cater specifically to kids, for instance, with autism or other kinds of special needs. So I think it's a totally valid concern to say we have these failing public schools and there will always be kids that are stuck there. We should really care about that. But I don't think the answer is so trap everybody else in there too.
So I'll just add a little pushback on that. So as a general matter, the argument that there is truly public, there's always school choice if you have money, but there's always school choice. So we go live in a better neighborhood. If you have money, you can, the city could do a private school, and the idea that now kids are getting trapped in schools that are public and they're not doing well. That's a fair thing, and it's true. Many public schools are struggling, particularly in cities. But I do think there's a pushback on the this isn't harming public schools. It is the taking resources. It's definitely draining. So there are only so many students, and if you look at the number of student population that are in many of the major public schools, and COVID accelerated this, it is down significantly, and they are not coming back. And the per pupil spending. My one push on that is that that's not a fair metric because the per pupil spending is going up because the students that are left in the public schools are the most challenging ones to have to educate. And it's really a question of how many students do you have? How healthy is the public school to begin with? So and this is not to denigrate the mission of what they're arguing about, but what you're pointing to, I think this is the reality. Public schools cannot compete. School choice it's a zero-sum game. It's taking money and taking students away.
Yeah, I think definitely you're right that we see when school choice programs are ended, we see students leave schools. But I do think the per pupil spending matters because if you look at how the public schools are choosing to spend the money, they do have more money per student ultimately than, you know, and if there's just so many other kinds and so a lot of other policy debates, but if you like administrative costs or how are we choosing to spend the money that we have, there's going to be transition periods that are hard. And saying like, okay, how many teachers do we need? Where can we cut back on administration costs? How can we make sure that our per pupil spending is actually going to help the pupils that we have and not that we're kind of maintaining this infrastructure for a lot of kids that we don't have anymore. Like how can we focus our mission and our resources on the kids that we do have? But I take your point. That's certainly like you do see enrollments go down. Yeah. Right.
I just fail to see how this whole chain of issues can't be solved by increasing teacher pay a lot. You mentioned earlier about how we've been increasing money going into public schools over and over and we're not seeing much results. But it seems to me like we're just increasing it to a point that's not sufficient, that the line is here that we need to reach. And although we're increasing it, we're still only like here. And it seems to me that all these kinds of problems would just be solved in terms of education if we just bump the pay to here. And now suddenly we have teacher resources, we have better teachers because we can hold on to them. We have people who are incentivized to get a master's degree in teaching and in education, which is really important for providing good education to students. And we have smaller class sizes because of the teachers that we're bringing in. I don't see why we need to like have this whole debate about private schools.
Just on the last point, how does increasing teacher pay due to smaller class sizes?
Because if you increase teacher pay, then you incentivize teachers to stick around instead of leaving
Okay.
after 5 years.
You'll have more teachers, but pay, okay.
Yeah, you have more
Yeah.
teachers, pay them more, and then suddenly our public school system is up to par with other countries who are outperforming us. I don't see how that doesn't solve the issue.
I'll have a couple points in response, I think. One, as an initial matter, I am not at all opposed to giving teachers more money. Like, I think if a teacher is doing a good job, specifically teachers who are doing a really good job should get more money. And teachers who are doing a terrible job should maybe get less money. I think that's a great idea to tie teacher pay to performance, and teachers who do a really great job at helping kids should make a lot of money. That's totally fine with me. I think as a secondary matter, it just, again, is not really borne out by the data that if you put more and more money, and maybe you're right, maybe there is a magic threshold that we just haven't reached yet, and that's why we haven't seen these great effects. But it hasn't borne out that putting more and more money into schools is actually working. And I think that, again, I would come to my point of, okay, maybe you're right, and maybe it's worth simultaneously trying this and trying to support our public schools by giving the public school teachers more money. You could be right. But how long is it going to take for that school to improve as a result of that intervention? We have no idea because we haven't seen it yet, right? We don't have an example to show of like, okay, well, we see that if we put this amount of teacher salary, suddenly all our problems go away and it's great, and that's the answer. We don't have anything that points to this being such a clean solution, and so it's really speculative of like, okay, if it is gonna work, how long is it gonna take? And again, there are kids in schools now. And if we allow innovation and we say, okay, we're gonna keep working on the public schools, but we're also gonna give you an alternative. And if your school is failing right now and not working for your kid right now, then you, parent who otherwise could not afford to leave the school, here, take some money, go somewhere else and see if you can find someone that's doing things differently and allowing innovation in education and allowing, schools to experiment and do different kinds of things and parents to find the school that's working best for their own child. So I think, again, it's just the immediacy of like, if you are a wealthy parent, you can take your kid out at any time, right? This is never an issue for you, but if you are a low income parent, to say, okay, we're gonna try this intervention and I hope it's gonna work for your kid by the time they graduate, that you missed a lot if you have to stick around and wait that out.
I would add a couple of quick things too. This is sort of counterpoint, to my earlier pushback on Ms. West's issue about it not funneling money and students out of schools, which it does. But she is right. The empirical data do not bear out that increasing more funding after a certain point. I mean, there are schools that need physical facilities to be up to par, and they're not doing it. But per pupil spending in public schools is really high. I mean, there are many city schools that are getting $30,000 per pupil. You can go to Exeter for that. So the question is, why is it that money is not creating the value that you need in the public school system? And that's a complicated question. So quite correct on the empirical side about more money is not necessarily the answer because there's already a lot of money going there. The teacher turnover rate is not huge in the public schools, in part because they're unionized and they have tenure, so you could stay for a really long period of time.
And you get your pension.
Right, and the pensions are great. So the teacher experience, and if you compare it to the Catholic schools and the private, maybe not Exeter, but the private schools, but the Catholic schools and the religious schools, they're not getting paid commensurately, honestly. And a lot of their new teachers are getting paid much less.
Yeah, my kids' teachers are in a Catholic school and do not make
Right.
as much. I don't think.
Right, much. So the money thing is not necessarily the answer. The question is what else is happening in the context of the schools, the public schools, that is making it not work. For so many students, and in many instances, it's just not working. The drain away from the public schools still is happening by offering choice, and so I think to your point, I think you have to look. It's much more complicated than the idea of just throwing more money at the schools, because that's been happening for a long period of time, and it hasn't moved the needle very much.
Oh, I was just going to. I mean, I don't want to take away a last word or anything. I don't suggest just throwing money at schools. I think that's probably an oversimplification. but specifically giving teachers more money. And it seems to me that the material differences between private schools that rich parents can afford and public schools is usually an amount of teacher pay and the quality of teachers that they get as a result of it. I mean, I'm no expert, but both of my parents are teachers. I come from a long line of teachers, and I did empirical work on this in undergrad. So it just seems to me like if you are able to hold on to somebody who has a PhD in science, that's going to be a lot better than for the public school system and for your students than if you can barely hold on to a 25-year-old straight out of college who has no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah,
So, but maybe I'm wrong, you know, that's fine. I have data that supports my point, you have data that supports your point. Maybe I'm wrong, that's totally
well,
fair.
there are a lot of studies on this, but independent of that, you know, one of the things you might think about is your example about it would be great to have a PhD who could stay. And I have a PhD and a JD, I cannot teach in the public schools. I'm not allowed to do it. So maybe one of the answers is, you know, what are the barriers here to getting good people to be able to come in? And if I were to retire, it might be kind of great to be able, there are a lot of people who would like to be able to give back in that way. So, so that's all, there's a lot of things going on in the public schools that might be problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about the draining away aspect to it, but I guess, one of the benefits to school vouchers is that they might, improve public schools, or at least mitigate the drain away with the competitive aspect.
Yeah.
So do you find that at least like empirically, like improves, outcomes, or at least mitigates the loss? And if so, like, if that can be part of an overall solution to encourage schools to improve with other mechanisms, just like reducing like obstacles for like other people to become teachers who are like experts in certain fields, sort of thing.
I'm less familiar with this data than I am with funding data. I do tend to recall that we see that it doesn't reduce student performance in public schools, and I'm not sure about what the data shows about improving. It certainly makes intuitive sense, right? That that's how it works in every other sphere of our economy, that if you have competition, it tends to improve things. But in terms of the empirical data, I don't want to make it up. I know that I do recall it does not decrease student performance in public schools. I think it has been shown, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually right. Although, and I think that's something the Cato Institute just did.
Yeah.
But I just don't know. Right, which I believe was on whether or not the increased competition was reducing school scores, or and they were finding it to be fairly, you know.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about, if you're not, so poor that you can't go to private school, but you're not so wealthy that, you can basically do school choice right now. If you're kind of in the middle class, where maybe you could afford to go to private school, but you really don't have else society. So you're kind of default to public school, and you'll be fine as your kids will be fine. They'll go out in the world. They're not gonna do amazing things or whatever. They're just gonna be part of the community. And right now they're in public school, they're interacting with different kinds of people, with different communities. If we put school choice and we give these people an option to kind of, isolate themselves in parts where they don't have to interact with poor people or minorities or whatever, and they can kind of really self-specify that I want my kids to go to this kind of school. Maybe we're decreasing test scores or whatever, but are we trying to do overall development of the children?
I think it's a really great question, and it's something that I have thought a lot about in my own personal life, actually, as a parent, not as a lawyer, because my husband and I both went to public school all the way K through 12, and for a variety of reasons, we've chosen to send our kids to private school. But I was really concerned about that, because I was one of the reasons that I had always thought growing up I was my kids to public school is because I think it's really important to be around lots of different kinds of people and to not be isolated in just a tiny fraction of your community. And so when we chose a school for our kids, it made a difference to us that it was a representative sample of the community. My kids go to school with a lot of a wide variety, like immigrants, low income kids, like there's a wide variety of different kinds of experiences in the school that they have. And so I think I agree that that is important, but also like, we already see that in private schools now, even without school choice, right? Like, I don't have school choice where I live. And my kids are in a Catholic school that's, you know, it's not as expensive as the usual like DC area schools. It's much more affordable and it's really diverse. Like, and they have a lot of programs for people who can't afford tuition, and there are discounts for multiple kids because they're Catholics and they want to have lots of babies. And so, I think we already see that there are private schools that are pretty diverse and like representative of the community. But I think that like ultimately, this is kind of a value judgment of parents that like, you know, less than it is a policy argument. Not totally, like the Supreme Court's in a case, a 1925 case, Meyer versus Nebraska. Nebraska had a law that said it is a crime to teach students foreign languages besides the classics, like classical languages. And someone was actually tried and convicted of teaching German to 10-year-olds in a private school. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? Nebraska is not totally crazy. It makes sense that there is a government interest in saying that our school system is going to create citizens of the United States, and we want them to have kind of a shared cultural value of the United States, and this is a real life government interest. But you can't it's not enough this interest is not enough to overcome the extremely compelling interest of parents choosing what's best for their children, which again is a fundamental liberty interest that the court has recognized for a really long time. And so there they said, you know, it's not crazy. There is a government interest here. And I think that's a government interest you're identifying, like making good citizens that interact with other people. But ultimately, it's not as important as families being able to make those decisions for themselves and what schools are going to be best for their children. But I am optimistic, I think, because like, again, the situation on the ground now is that a lot of private schools, especially a lot of, you know, of the lower class private schools, like the Catholic schools, they are really diverse and they represent the community. The super elite schools that are like all, you know, they cost $50,000 a year from kindergarten up, which also are in my area, like those schools are not going to be representative of the community, even if we have school choice. Like there will always be people in those schools for sure. And like parents who have different values and goals and amounts of money than I do might choose them. But I don't think practically it's going to be as big a problem.
I was gonna say, it's a totally legitimate concern, right? Because there is an interest in making sure that our community is able to interact with a large and diverse group of individuals. And a couple of observations though. I think Ms. West is right. A lot of the parochial schools are incredibly diverse, both income wise, racially, you know, and actually religiously too.
Yeah,
Are very, very diverse. Some of the pathologies with the lack of diversity in school are actually more acute in the public school system, because in reality, there are many public schools that are almost all single race. And this is a function of zip codes. So and they're generally not happening. And so in the middle class neighborhoods like that, if it's a diverse neighborhood, the school is diverse. So I think your concern is totally legitimate, but I think the school choice side of this is not creating that pathology, is being created in other ways in the public school system.
All right, we have time for one more question. Do you have any?
I have a question. It's a little bit half-baked, so I apologize in advance.
It's my favorite kind.
Good. So it seems to me like if school choice became like the national norm, it would obviously increase the number of students that go to private schools, and that would in turn increase the number of private schools that need to meet demand. So it seems to me like the result of that would be more private schools than we have now. And I was just wondering, how, if you agree that that increase would happen, how do you see that taking shape? Where, like, would it be mainly public school teachers getting jobs in the private sector? Would it be a new group of people graduating from universities going to these schools? And do you think that there would be any problems with, like, for example, if there are issues with public school teachers and those teachers start moving to private schools because that's the growing market, do you see any of the issues that we're seeing in public schools? private school kids?
I love that question. I think because it is exciting to think about like what could happen if we actually had a free, like open market for education. It's so beyond our comprehension because the public school system has been the norm for our entire history. And so we haven't really had innovation. Like if you look at the school day and like what school looks like, it's pretty much the same as it was, 150 years ago. Like you go and you sit and you learn and you leave, and like there has been some innovation, but it's not as much. There's not a lot of variety even between public and private schools as to a certain degree. And I do think if you give parents resources to choose their schools and you create this kind of market for education, there will be a lot more variety. And I actually have an interesting data point on that, which is before I worked at IJ, one of the things I did at kind of working pro bono at the firm I was at is I represented a school in Georgia. And I wrote an amicus brief for them in the Espinoza case when it was in the Montana Supreme Court. And the reason that a little school in Georgia was weighing in this case in Montana was because they were an incredibly niche, innovative school. They were an LGBT school. And so they were called the Pride School, and they expressly advertised themselves as being like, we'll take anybody, but we are staffed by people who are LGBT, and we are like, understanding of the specific concerns of families that look different than the average family in Georgia. And if you want to have a space that is like a protected kind of safe space for you, then this is a good place for you. And that's just kind of like an interesting thing, like that's not something that I would have ever conceived of until I heard from them and represented them. And it is interesting to think about, like, I do think there would be a lot of innovation and different kinds of schools serving different kinds of kids and families. And I had another point that I am totally blanking on, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Chutkow for any thoughts on that.
I think that's a fine summary, and in terms of what this is going to look like, I mean, obviously this is coming. I mean, again, COVID, we've seen this uptick in sort of private money and public money going to private schools. But it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. I think the point here is that there can be a broad, diverse range of options available. But it is one of those situations where I think we just don't know, and that causes anxiety and concern, which is completely understandable. But it is already, that train is already on the tracks.
All right, please give a round of applause for our speaker.
Big trouble if I don't mention, if you are interested in one of IJ's programs, either for summer or semester or coming to work at IJ full time, there are some flyers here that talk about our various programs. And also my email address is kwest@ij.org. And if you have any questions about this, or just like what it's like to be a public interest litigator, how much money do you make? Can I make a living doing this? I'm happy to answer any questions like that as well.
Absolutely. So just a couple of announcements before we go. First one, just administratively,